Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson,
I'm Carson Grubaugh. Welcome to Living the Line.
and today we are joined with a special guest, somebody who has been with us before, the author of some of the greatest fantasy comics of the past decade that I've ever read, Mr. Alexis Deacon. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great, thank you. Yeah, very, very excited to be back, and big changes here because I just had a little baby boy, so I
Congratulations,
haven't
that's
slept much
awesome.
for the past couple of weeks. I might be a little bit deranged, but that could make for good content, as I was saying to
Yeah.
Carson earlier.
Well, that is a change and a half, and
Yeah.
as kid, my kids are now getting to the age where I can actually do things at night. I played water polo twice this week.
Wow.
Won't tell anybody, yeah. First time in 2 decades. A 4 and a 7-year-old is what I got now. Let me tell you, you're heading there. It'll happen, right? Uh, uh, can enjoy, believe it or not, this book I think that we're looking at today, Shuna's Journey by Hayao Miyazaki. It's an interesting book that you've brought to us here, Alexis, because it hits in that sort of sweet spot where, well, I mean, we probably should just take a look at it, but what age range would you say this book exists for? I mean, obviously not your 6 week old.
No, I mean I could read it to him. I'm not sure how much he would get from it. Just try and osmose it, like people play bark to kids in the womb. I think with stuff like this, it's sort of like there's like a minimum pickup age, isn't there, when you start to get anything from it.
Right.
I imagine you'd want to be at least 6 years old.
Right.
And that's a tad young. So yeah, 7, 8, 9. Imagine once you're getting into 9, 10, you're really getting a lot from it. But I think myself as a 6-year-old, there's definitely things I would have enjoyed here.
Yeah.
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 And definitely one of those books, very similar to Miyazaki's Nausicaa, where the things that you're getting out of it are almost entirely dependent on your age and experience, where you can revisit it and just be blown away by the stuff that was like embedded there from the beginning.
Yeah, it has like
Yeah,
a
I think that's one of the
universal.
one of the nicest things about this.
Right.
It
Yeah,
sort
there's
of
like a
runs through all of his work, doesn't it?
It does. Interestingly enough, as somebody who has a reputation as being, a Japanese creator, or some of his stuff is so set, in a very specific location to the point where he was insistent on certain things not being localized and stuff, because this is a Japanese story. As somebody who has that reputation, this is a very cosmopolitan is not quite the right word, but international story. It sort of fits in with the international side of his works, his ones that are sort of unbound by any particular location or nationality or anything like that. Yeah, universal.
yeah, it has, to me, it felt like when you talk about Joseph Campbell or Jungian archetypes and stuff, that is just a story that speaks to, it's like a myth that is giving a lesson about the core needs of humanity, and that transports to any culture. Like, that's my real big takeaway. I'll say more about that as we go, but I mean, it's a story about wheat, right? And
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
like
it literally is taken from a folk tale about the arrival of wheat to Tibet. Is
Bet,
that right?
right. Yeah, so this let's give this a teeny bit of context. So, like Alexis just said, this is supposedly based on a Tibetan folk tale, and I think based on is a fairly loose thing to say. The translator, Alex DeWitt, has a little bit of info about that folk tale at the back, but I would say equally to that folktale, he kind of brushes up against the Earthsea stories, and I think Earthsea is a very, very significant influence on this, both from a storytelling perspective and a setting perspective. So, just to put this in context, this is a work that Miyazaki made in 1983. This is a year after Nausicaa had started as a serialized manga in Anime magazine, and 4 years after Miyazaki had made what is now regarded as a groundbreaking animation, Castle of Cagliostro, but at the time was seen as a commercial failure and really stunted, slowed down Miyazaki's animation career. So you have this guy who is just stunning visualist and can basically do anything he wants in terms of pulling things out of his brain, in terms of incorporating visual and cultural influences. And he's kind of constipated. He's gone and had many years of working gone back to doing storyboards and things like that and directing for TV, but like not really being satisfied with the work and trying to concurrently develop all of these different quite wild ideas, knowing what we do now, what's going to happen eventually when he founds his own animation studio. It's kind of wild to think he was trying to like adapt a Richard Corbin short story into a film and things like that. So this was done at a sort of like really fertile period where he didn't have an outlet for all of these ideas. And if you look at the full painted art, you can see that essentially he's making a storyboard. This is really similar to the production drawings and paintings that he did for Nausicaa as it started to be developed into a film.
And how's the seeds, like you two probably know a lot more about Miyazaki than me, but even on a limited knowledge of his career, having seen some films, I saw seeds of like at least 4 of his other stories or something like that in here. It's pretty.
There's
pretty
very
wild.
close connections to many of his other works. Yeah, I mean, especially Princess Mononoke and Nausicaa. I mean, there's some characters and locations that almost repeat, identically, just slightly different shifts in the notion, in the nature of the character or the place. But it's sort of arrived here in quite a fully formed state, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Scary.
Despite, let's say, the reputation of this story, like when you hear Shuna's Journey talked about prior to it actually coming out in English, it's always talked about as if it's like Nausicaa's second cousin or Nausicaa's grandparent or something, like this sort of like undeveloped thing. But quite to the contrary. I mean, I think that the brevity, really belies the depth that's underneath. It really is a fully formed story, and it really feels, I mean, to me, like development sketches for a, film, a fairly long, complex kind of film. And it's just stunning to me that he could do this concurrently with the Nausicaa manga and developing it for a film.
I mean, formally, as a comics artist, I find it really interesting because a lot of the time, what you're battling with, I'm sure you're both also aware, is the pressure of time and the amount of content you can deliver with the amount of drawing you can get done. And I think this does a fantastic job of delivering a really rich and complex story with very, very efficient use of imagery. It might be worth mentioning that the typography, when translated to English, looks a little awkward on the artwork. The original Japanese edition does look quite a bit nicer. It's got those kind of vertical lines which fit with the flow of the imagery a bit better. And also sometimes the text will be printed in a color.
Right.
There's a few instances in this edition where you'll get a text block over a sort of dark mass, and it'll look very uncomfortable. You can see that sort of bottom right panel there. It doesn't, and the text looks squeezed in both that one and the big half page. That happens quite a bit. But in a way, I found that also quite liberating, that those little quirks of design, they didn't really get in the way of my enjoying or appreciating the story, because all the essential stuff was there.
Right, including the stunning design. So this is Shuna. He lives in a village. Should we go back one page, Carson?
Yeah.
He lives in this village that is, we're told, nestled between mountains, and they give you a geologic explanation of how this is formed. But basically, these people are insulated from the outside world. But if you look and you see that little look at this carving that's on the outside of this here, you see this wheat reaching up towards a sort of pseudo sun wheat structure there. So Shuna's main driving force here, this stranger comes and has a different kind of wheat with him, and they have very, very paltry crop yields where they live, and there's no real there's sort of a population pressure because they can't expand. Their village doesn't get any larger because of the limitations of the food that they have. They don't have any wheat or barley or whatever it is that he has, and the stranger has it, and the stranger shows it to him and tells him a story about it, and basically says well, you can't grow anything from this. This is hulled. It's dead inside, and that kind of carries through the story there. So if this is dead, it looks live, right? But it's dead inside. So where's the thing that can grow? And it's the
Which
stunning
you know, you were talking about the language of story as metaphor and having deeper resonances and deeper meanings. What better way could you have to start a story than something which is dead inside and can't grow?
right.
And then through the agency of the central character, they go on this difficult journey, and somehow through their experiences, growth can return, the world can get moving again. I just wanted to pause on this page here, because I thought, like, throughout the sequence that Miyazaki opens with, we see such good examples of the way that he lets you build the world for yourself by the content of the pictures outside of what's directly relevant to the text. So there's this really sort of prominent female figure painted onto the ceiling of this hut where the visitor's being treated for his sickness. And it's just, it's so clear to the reader that that implies a religion. It implies, you know, some sort of belief system of this community, but it's never, that's never closely described. So you as reader have to put a big piece of yourself in there to kind of bring that to life. And I feel like that's something that he does really well and consistently throughout this book. We'll see again and again these examples of aspects of the world which are never described. They're just kind of there in the background, but you know that this is a world that is it has a depth in time. The people have inner lives. They do things for reasons. As we're flipping through, we'll see Miyazaki, you know, The Wind Rises, where you've got all those drawings and animations of airplanes. Yeah, this one here, bottom left, where he's on the bullet making machine. One of the things I really like about Miyazaki's world, and it's something that I could never replicate myself, a little bit like with Tolkien, where you got the idea that if for every sentence of a language, you know, the guy had thought about the whole grammatic system behind it. Every time you see a mechanism in a Miyazaki work, you feel like he's thought about how that mechanism functions. So like this little bullet making thing here, you can see that that has like a mechanical sense to it. And I feel like that sort of way of thinking runs through the way he constructs stories as well. There's like a larger machine which works, like a society which works, but which is not revealed to you. And you're just given these little pieces of it. And that makes it feel very alive, I think.
Yeah, as opposed to a story where you jump in. This is one of my least favorite things is they jump in and they just immediately start like throwing like 30 names at you of all the different societies and how they interrelate. And it feels like when my students come to me and they're explaining their epic that they have in their head or their video game, and it's like, whoa, slow down, just tell me what's the story about. And like, yeah, put that stuff in there, but let the, like you're talking about now that you've mentioned it, because I did a real quick read through, but what you're talking about, like, yeah, I hadn't noticed that because I hadn't really glommed onto what the story was about yet, that there's the wheat there. And now that you've pointed out, Alexis, I'm seeing this page is chock full of these incidental designs in the background. There's like a tapestry here that obviously has a story on it. There's another animal here. To me, that's the right way to build the world. And then maybe if you had a longer book, a character could make a comment about it or something, but instead of dumping it, you just show it.
And there's a certain kind of mentality, I think, that can be present even in creators that you might end up really enjoying, that can't resist giving you the detail. Like if this was a Masamune Shirow comic, we would have a four-page explanation about the bullet machine and how Shuna had received the knowledge required to turn his loom into a bullet machine. And the virtues of this bullet machine versus the bullet machine from the village next door, and that's a different kind of reading experience. But this is the presentational, everything is just sort of integrated. And I'm going to come back to Earthsea, this is not just a wild pull, by the way. It's documented that Miyazaki actually worked on development for a adaptation of Earthsea prior to this, so somewhere between
quite close to this time as well, wasn't it?
So somewhere in the period between 1979 and 1982, he was working on an Earthsea adaptation, but was unable to get the license to it, which is a real shame. but this is basically a series of novels that were written by Ursula Le Guin, is one of the great American science fiction fantasy writers. She's generally regarded as a fantasy writer, but if you read her stuff, it's very tightly constructed in a sort of plausible science fiction sort of sense. And the first two Earthsea novels, I think, have just as much influence on this story as does the original Tibetan myth, in which this very close to the vest, very disciplined, eventually wizard Ged goes and frees this person from this horrible situation, and in turn, in the second, he is eventually freed by her in another novel, and that sort of parallelism exists in this story, and sort of some of the general things that we're talking about here as international features, just the sort of like myth, the centralism of myth, and how you can make specific details both alien but familiar.
Talking of international influences, perfect timing, Sean. We don't plan these things out, but when I turned to this, I was like, oh, there's he's been looking at Moebius.
That's
Right.
that just screams out of that page, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was thinking the same. Something I noticed just on the page, on the previous page, there's this really cute graphic device there. I don't know whether it was conscious on his part, but there's an inversion of the arch. So you've got bright arch, bright figure, and then dark inverted arch and dark figure. That's just a really cute compositional contrast.
No, that has to be intentional, because it's like it's like home and leaving home, right? Yeah. Like that's I mean, subconscious or not. Yeah,
very effective, isn't it?
Wow. So anyways, story-wise, at this point, you have Shuna's the prince, and he's been sent out to find this golden grain, basically. So at that point, I knew, okay, we're dealing with like deep archetypes of, the dying and risen grain god, basically.
Right. And you can see the sort of very mild nods to Tibetan trapping here, in that Shuna has a fur-lined hat, the sort of general like skirt-like appearance with the fur-lined boots, and then his animal here, which we're going to see the mechanics of the animal, is llama-ish, let's say, reindeer-ish, llama-ish. And here's the deep time you were talking about, Alexis.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of that kind of deep time. Very lightly worn,
And the fact that you go into this thing feeling like it's a fantasy book, but they've got rifles and mechanics and stuff like that. And then I just started reading Nausicaa, and it has that same feel of like they're flying around and using machinery. That really adds to that timelessness of it as well, where it's like I can't place it like a society growing or a society that's devolved. It's really hard to nail where this exists within the evolution of the culture of the world, which is
well fun. And despite the tropes of historical fiction now, this is how history really was. I mean, developments didn't just spread instantaneously. People figured out that I can sit on a horse and then I can kill my enemies, and that didn't just magically happen. Like, you had to sit on the horse, you had to have the right kind of stirrup. I mean, there's a I don't know if you guys are familiar with the historic argument that basically certain conquering armies won because they had a certain kind of stirrup, and that stirrup slowly passed from place to place as the other areas were conquered, and they were able to find examples. So this kind of mixed technological environment, as surprising as it seems from our perspective now, is actually the norm, I think, throughout human history.
Yeah, and it feels right. Mm-hmm. Feels right. But then you get like, here I see this reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle. You got this gigantic like patched together ship, but it was a ship that was like a big moving, it seems like a floating ship, or the desert dried out or something. So this was one of those ones where I saw like he probably had a ton of ideas in his head, and I don't know whether they're developed or he's going back and picking up on one idea and developing it further. But I was seeing seeds of the few works of his that I do know. That was one of them I noticed.
Well, I think you definitely see evidence of that in the works that did make it through to either cinema release or publication or whatever. because a lot of stuff is kind of cannibalized and shared between them. I mean, Yaku is a perfect example. The animal that he's riding there has a central role in Princess Mononoke. Keeps the name as a species name in this story, but becomes the kind of character name in Mononoke. Just on a drawing note, this double page spread exhibits a lot of traits that I try and sort of aspire to in my own work, because when you're drawing man-made structures and architecture and construct, it's really difficult to retain the sense of rhythm, kind of the quality that you get when drawing something organic. And I think that Miyazaki does a wonderful job varying the rhythm of the shapes of the stones and the pieces of wood, and introducing just the right level of distress in there, so that even though it's clearly something structured and constructed, graphically it's still super alive.
And not stiff. I think that's why that and the color palette, when I knew we were going to be talking about this book with you, so I had you in mind, and I got to this page and I was like, oh, that could be a page out of Curse of the Chosen, because of some of the weathered architecture, the coloring and things like that. I do think actually these two images here also kind of like spoke to me of your work. Also, this feels like very Charles Vess to me, something about the eyes in this character.
The architectural tendency that you're talking about, I think there's another angle to sort of get at too, something that Gerhard, the background artist on Cerebus, told me when I interviewed him 12 years ago, that when he was starting out, he was drawing bricks instead of drawing a wall. And especially when you have already done all the planning, and if you're making, a bunch of vanishing points and things like that, and you've already sort of figured out where everything goes, it can be a tendency to want to put all those lines in, right? But you're right, like he's like drawing masses, and not delineating every single one, but rather suggesting light and suggesting form by which ones he's actually going out picking out.
Yeah. Or where the shadows are, where he leaves some gaps in the lines. I think that's something I've been seeing a lot. A lot of artists that I've been seeing lately, the younger generation, I don't know they're directly looking at Miyazaki, but he lets his lines break up a lot. I've seen a lot more of that, like broken contours and kind of stutter to lines that he has, that opens up the world and makes it feel like everything exists in the same plane. It's really beautiful.
There's a little continuity error here. She gets her left hand blown up and it's a right hand on the ground there.
Gotta switch that thumb around.
Yeah, gotta switch that thumb.
I love that you're willing to go in and like an absolute master who's obviously one of your favorites, and you're still willing to see an error. Like that's
but
super.
One of the things I love about Miyazaki is he's good where he needs to be good. And sometimes he's quite sloppy in other areas, and it doesn't really matter because he's so good where he needs to be good. One of the things that you'll notice throughout this book is that his color work is often not that great. He loses control of the contrast quite a few times. When we get through to the cityscape, you'll see things, like that blue there is a bit of a mess. And that sort of thing happens quite a bit. Like I guess he just has his watercolor set there on the table. He's working through quite quickly, and he's not really thinking about, his atmospheric perspective is sometimes quite good, but sometimes way off. It's definitely a poor cousin to his line work, but it doesn't matter because everything else is like so masterfully done. There's actually clear examples. The covers of Nausicaa, which I have behind me, are very soupy in their color schemes, very similar value, low contrast, and kind of poor differentiation between color masses. It doesn't matter,
So like this one right here, if this was going to be a finished, like a single image or whatever, knocking out the blue to be both less intense and also a lighter value would help separate out the sky as an individual plane from the towers. Would that be your approach?
Exactly. And the white of the towers there. So if you're seeing a scene like that in life, that white is not going to be lighter than the sky, certainly not to that degree.
Right.
and then you've got things like that very vibrant red turret.
Right.
It kind of throws off the atmospheric perspective because you're not doing anything with your closer values to kind of the tonal range should decrease as you get closer to the background, but it's that's a very high contrast element, that bright red beside that very dark blue, and it just kind of throws off the sense of depth in that particular image.
Yeah,
there's also
all the
a good example of
desaturations
text.
like down here.
What's that?
All the desaturations like down
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like it's an inverse of what the scheme probably should be for that to work in terms of to put you in that location. The text is also in a horrible position there, black on that dark blue.
I noticed that a few times, like when you pass like 50% gray, just make it white.
I wonder whether in the Japanese edition that wasn't a color or a white.
Right.
It just looks so clumsy there. I can't believe he would do that.
Well, I think that's just who is this book? But this is first second first second put this out. So that was, I think, just a production error on their part. If he was doing color in the original one, they should have mimicked that.
Yeah, I guess there's only so much money you can put into something like this, and most of the time you just want to change the plate. They've got some whiteout text there.
Yeah, they've done it here. So
this is an example, actually. This old character, very similar to a character in Mononoke. Do you remember when he comes, when the prince comes to the town, he buys rice with his gold nugget, and then that old guy follows him, and he crops up later in the forest. Very, very similar character to this fellow. I think the hat is almost identical.
But and this is Miyazaki's granny face. This is Granny in Totoro with a different hair.
Yeah, he's not afraid to use I mean, when you're an animator, you sort of have to use the same things over and over, right? Yeah. Otherwise, you can't keep reinventing the wheel, or your team is going to lose their minds.
Right. Tezuka, of course, the father of the manga, animation combination, called it his star system. He essentially had 15 faces that he was willing to trot out at any given time. And if you recognize the character from thing to thing, well, that was his star was playing this one. This is the character so-and-so playing the role of somebody else.
That's a lovely way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's smart. Actually, I have a buddy, Brian Payne. I just actually released a video today that had some of his comics in it. He does photorealism, but he's in Alaska, and it's pretty much him and his wife that he knows. And so he just uses the two of them in no matter what story he's in. And he has that same idea of like, look, we're just actors. Like, no one complains about Tom Cruise being multiple characters, or no one complains about Ryan Reynolds being both Deadpool and Green Lantern. So why can't we use characters in comics? And it's a really good point.
Yeah, it's a fair argument.
Really smart. So in terms of the overall narrative of the story, I thought this scene was really important because he's starting to lose faith. Like, as he's on that archetypal hero's journey, that original faith that he leaves with is now being beat up, especially as he goes in and he hits society. And I don't know, I think that's something a lot of us have probably been struggling with during the COVID years and post-COVID years. It seems like everyone's a little bit like, society is wearing us down, and more and more people are wanting to check out to their cabins. And I feel like this is a really well timed release of this book, because this is the book about pushing through that, and like society is, culture or something is dying and rotten right now, and pushing through and finding that golden grain that's going to save it.
Right. He leaves this secured place, and he finds slavery. These poor kids are enslaved by these slavers. We don't get any idea of why they're doing what they're doing, other than the fact that they're doing it. And he finds in this town there's massive amounts of wheat, but nobody seems to know how to grow it, and he never finds any seed or anything. So. And in the course of a chapter or two, he just decides he's not gonna let this shit go. He's gonna save these two particular girls, regardless of what else happens, these are the two that it's gonna do it. And so he goes and surrounds basically ambushes this slave vehicle and kills every single person on the slave ship by basically being able to shoot better than they can. Weird detail
Great
here.
picture, isn't it?
Yeah, that's just fantastic. That we've talked about this kind of thing a couple times. So there's certain kinds of heroic tropes that only exist in movies, and then there are certain types of heroic tropes that are real. Like, for instance, shooting off of horseback or mount is something that was thought to be totally ridiculous. That basically people just didn't think it was possible. But there were Indian tribes that could do it, and they just had better relationships with their horses. It's like, and were better marksmen, for whatever reason, whether they just practiced more or treated their horses better or whatever. This is an interesting example of that kind of thing, where at first it might seem like a sort of heroic action movie trope, but basically Shuna has a real relationship with his mount, and that carries over to him being able to fire his rifle from a mounted position, and he runs these guys ragged and is able to kill every single one of the guards.
And they're like higher tech, right? So it's that idea of like higher tech with low competence doesn't necessarily buy you anything. Low tech, high competence can buy you.
And that's a trope throughout his work as well, isn't it? You see that character, that kind of character archetype return again and again. The highly skilled lone warrior with the more primitive technology.
And that's like an essential thing, because we are headed to higher and higher tech. I mean, this stuff about the chat GPT stuff that I saw, like AI are now passing like some kind of high level exams with like a B+. So we're heading towards like tech competence, but as we do that, we're all losing actual competence. And that's part of that revivification of like the society is dying, that our actual competence is dying.
It's funny that this has been a trope throughout Miyazaki's work, this kind of feeling of a disconnect from our root, whether that be in nature or with our connection to each other. It occurs again and again. It's interesting how fully formed it was at this early stage, that you have these same sort of themes. Obviously, it's just gotten to be more and more so as time has gone by.
You could see that particular trope. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that particular trope you could see as a very Japanese kind of trope as well, because the warrior with the sword, you could conceivably have a situation where someone is such a good swordsman that they could kill hundreds or thousands of people before being killed themselves. That your skill and competence could insulate you from death in a direct combat, and the fact that Japan imported this other technology that then reduced that likelihood. They didn't get to skip if you were there for the development of the gun, and a gun takes 20 seconds to reload, that there's still that sort of skill gap can still exist, right? But as soon as there's a rifle that can fire multiple rounds, that skill gap starts to diminish. And so you have a country like Japan where a whole class of people and a whole skill class was sort of wiped out by an imported technology. I'm sorry that...
I was just going to ask, like, what age
it's actually quite an important point to touch on. This idea, Japan has the notion of the master craftsman and the life dedicated to craft is shot through a lot of their culture, and in animation, animation is no exception. Have you seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi?
I haven't.
This film about the sushi master in Japan. There's this kind of a trope of someone for whom craft becomes almost as like a semi-religious thing, the dedication of one's life to craft, the perfection of craft. And it often leaves this kind of like ripple through the generations, where as a result, you're so fixed on your pursuit to your craft that you kind of neglect your other responsibilities. And you have this kind of these father-son relationships where the father has dedicated all his life and energy to the perfection of this one thing, whilst in the meantime producing other humans. And, they then feel that they have to step into this craft to be seen. And
right.
I know that happened a little bit with him and his son.
With Miyazaki and his son.
Yeah.
And that's certainly shot through the relationships that Tezuka had with his children, to bring it back to Tezuka, as well. You know, that he was the father in biology, you know, and otherwise his children were his comics.
Well, and that goes to like the generational rejuvenation that's behind these type of stories too. Like that's the other side of it, right? If you go too far one way, you're neglecting the next generation. So that use of competence and craft has to be like what Shuna's doing, is that competence is in aid of the collective, right? The individual pursuit for greatness has to have some relationship to the collective concern. If it goes too far in your own direction, that could be dangerous as well.
That is something that's very redemptive in, if you're looking at his work through that lens. You know, all of his work is very aware of humanity, and you know, trying to improve and enrich the human experience. And whenever you see him talk about his work, it's very important to him that it be emotionally present, you know, and meaningful and positive.
Yeah.
And I think it has helped an incredible number of people. I mean, we haven't actually talked about this yet, but first time I encountered Miyazaki's work, I was quite old. I think I was in my early 20s, and it was just, you know, revelatory experience. It really, really spoke to me, and I know it speaks to millions of others as well.
Yeah, this is coming for me at a time, maybe that's why I keep going back to it so much, where I've been thinking a lot about our need for story. That's been a huge obsession for me for the last year or two. And also pushing against that, like I feel like the need for parable and story has childishness built into it a bit, and that our species needs things to be, we can't just tell someone this is what you need to do. You got to like wrap it up. And I think it really hit me when I went to the graduation ceremony, and we're all still wearing these robes that we don't know what they mean, and there's all this pomp and circumstance, and I was like, what a fucking childish species we are, that we have to get dressed up in these special costumes to make things meaningful. So it's like, but then if you go the opposite of that, you basically get the scientific worldview is like, let's just tell you logically exactly how things are, and that never lands for anybody. And
I mean, I think you could say the same thing you just said, but in a different tone of voice. You know, we are a childish species,
right?
And it's just a fact. And I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of either.
Yeah, I've been struggling with that. Like, can we grow? Should we even grow? Because if you grow towards the scientific viewpoint, that's even worse, right? That's been horrific for us. So then over the last couple months, I've been coming back to no. We need to reestablish stories, and I've been having a real push and pull with okay, like what's the admixture of those two that's healthiest? I don't know, but this book came for me like, I really, other than seeing a couple Miyazaki movies here and there, this is my first real thoughtful exposure to Miyazaki, and it came at that perfect time, you know, where it is speaking to me and enriching me in exactly the way I need.
I think this is a quite intense scene that carries it forward. So he's been followed by these slavers, and he tells the girls that they need to take his mount and go, because basically they're going to kill it if they keep on running with the three of them on it. And he sets a trap for these, slavers by basically making these little cairns, these little rock encasings with bullets inside them. And he can see them easily. They don't look particularly, suspect or anything. And he can fire from a position of concealment and fire at those things, and they basically detonate and send out shrapnel that drives those guys crazy and drives them off the cliff.
Another, like, that's a masterful bit of storytelling from a technical standpoint as well. If we go to start that sequence from, if we go like 1 or 2 pages back, here. So you'll see that the night sequence with these lovely kind of Van Gogh type stars, which have this kind of radiant mark making, suddenly the color, the whole world becomes much lighter in touch. A monochrome palette, the line work and the color are much more muted, and there's less going on in terms of contrast if you leave out the sky. And what that does is it sets up the drama of the following scene. So again, here we see we're in this, everything is calm in its treatment, in its palette, in its composition. You know, he very rarely does this, but there's a composition bottom right where two characters are just looking side on balance,
Right.
you know, no background. Everything that there's a pause in the breath of the story, which allows you then on the turn of the page to suddenly gather energy, because you haven't been dealing with energy. You know, if we were to go with, if we start with that beautiful picture of the ship and the rock wall of the ship with the lady looking out the window, and then you go to this sequence, it doesn't work because we haven't had that pause before the action. But because we've had that setup, this dynamic page is super effective. And then the wonderful sequence of the animals being led down the cliff, where he's in perfect control of color contrast, by the way. And then that's a transitional moment for him, isn't it? Then you see this kind of otherworldly figure zoom over his head, and you got that beautiful full bleed spread. I think it's on the next page where it just zooms off into the distance. A really, really strong visual sequence.
To his destination, we should say as well.
Yes,
so,
taking him. This is it. It's a story of many thresholds, isn't it? Very mythic type of story where the character passes through thresholds, and with each threshold, they change. Something has been either taken from them or added to them forever. I really like this. I think it's very strong stuff.
The Latin word for door. The Latin word for door is porta, which was also used for ships, because the ship comes through the door into the thing. And I think about that a lot with this type of storytelling. You know, the door is a gate, is a you know, the next destination. I'm sorry.
And he's choosing, like the character is choosing to go through the doors, which is something that I noticed. I think Harry Potter's probably the first big one I can think of that shifted from the type of stories I got as a kid to the type of stories people are seeing now, where like the Goonies, all the Never-Ending Story, the stuff that I saw as a kid, the kid always makes the decision to go on the journey, and then something shifted where you get Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and stuff, where they come to and they're like, you're the chosen one, and they kind of just tell the kid to go. And I really think it's healthier to tell these stories where the character chooses to set out. You're not the special chosen one, you're just someone who chooses to become special by continuing to climb down the side of this crazy thing and put yourself at risk, you know. And here's another one of those world building things, Sean.
Yeah, perfect example.
Pick out Shuna on the second page there.
Yeah, can you point him out for us?
Yeah, I mean
that's perfect, isn't it?
It's just unbelievable. I mean that's the stuff right there. That this just kills me. This whole 4-page sequence right here, and this one really reminds me of a particular sequence in a fantasy novel that was coming out at the same time, which is The Shadow of the Torturer, where this character climbs down a hillside and basically sees geologic, you know,
climbing through geologic time.
Exactly, he climbs through time, and there's a similar kind of thing happening here, where the cliffside, you know, some type of eruption or whatever has exposed different strata. And so he's seeing these ancient statues, and then obviously much more ancient than that, the bones of some kind of dragon or dinosaur or something that existed before.
And then this crystal wall right here. I love that.
It's just one panel. It's so memorable. It's funny, it sets up another Miyazaki trope, which I actually also have recurring dreams about this, so it must be something in human psyche, but the kind of like primordial fish all over the place. I love that. That scene occurs in quite a few of his works, including the new one that's coming out, I think.
Well,
but yeah,
and
I love this. It's just like
it's
very
funny
shallow,
that you
giant, like boneless sea creatures oozing through it.
it's funny that you mentioned that you had dreams about that, because the note that I just pulled off that I put there is Shuna comes down to the shoreline and he knows that he needs to get to this over here. Like he's trying to go to the land of the gods, basically, but the ocean's in the way. And so he goes to sleep. And when he's woken up, the tide has receded and the path has opened up. And so I wrote the note that sleep provides clarity. There's something, I think there's something about that primordial, like in our personal life, in my personal life, I've been going through a lot lately, like to my limit, like mild nervous breakdown a lot. And I was on blood pressure medication and stuff. Like I just, my heart rate was always at like my blood pressure was always like 150. I had the mental part under control. I went to sleep and I had a dream, and then I read this like 3 days later. I had a dream that lasted all night. I'd wake up to go to the bathroom, I'd go back to sleep, and I'd be back in the story. And it was the craziest, like weirdest dream. And I woke up and my heart was good. Like I felt better, and my mind processed something in my sleep that was like, I don't even know what it is yet, but some kind of clarity for the way forward happened in my sleep. And that this scene, and so you mentioning that you have dreams like this is kind of chilling to me, because that's what it is, right? Like something receded and the way forward is now clear.
And if you accept that he's going down in geologic time, and then at the bottom is, of course, this ancient thing that's much older than any of us, there's a sort of alienness to that kind of sea life, and especially the idea that it's hidden underneath the water. The more normal thing has the older ancient thing underneath it. And when he actually passes through and he's in this place of plenty, he thinks, but he notices immediately, he thinks he's arrived basically, but he notices almost immediately that his rifle and his clothes have aged dramatically in what seems to him to have only been a couple hours having passed. And so, he's still inside the alienness. Those ancient boneless creatures are still present. He's still inside the ancient thing that he's not supposed to be relating to. This is other than him,
or that he should be related to. I mean, that's where some of the clarity comes from, is when you look back to your narrative past and your biological evolutionary past. That's where some of the answers are at, right? I think that's the main core theme of this story. It's going to feel alien, and of course you can't, it would be foolish to try and go live that way again, but don't forget the lessons of it, I think is the story.
This brings me back to something I was going to say when you were talking about growth and remembering where you came from. If you define growth as moving to different points on a line, then you're getting more and more distant from where you came from. But often that's not the way that things grow. Take a tree, for example. Like you start with a core and then another surface builds around it, and then another surface builds around it, but the core never really changes. And I think that's sort of where we're at as human beings. We still have the same core we've always had, whether you look at that in the context of your own life or in the context, a broader context of us as a species. The same sorts of things are important to us as were important to us at the very beginning. And yeah, if you become too fixated on the surface of where you are at this present moment, that core can seem very distant, but it's still nonetheless right at the heart of what you are, even though you've grown all this way. And you can sort of never get away from that.
You're gonna make me cry, Alexis, because that reframed that thing that I've been struggling with, so I can move forward with it a little bit. Because you're right, we have been tending to treat growth as linear progression, and I think I think society's been doing that for a long time, and so it's seen as regressive to go back to the core, right? We've moved away from it. I've actually at work having to been arguing a lot that I'm handed people that are 18 years old, and they have all of this kind of, society has failed them in a number of ways, and we're supposed to help them somehow. But we keep kind of luckily where I'm at now, we don't have this mindset, but a lot of education has always treated as like, here's a rotten fruit, I need you to fix the rotten fruit. And I've always said, you can't fix the fruit, you have to fix the root. And that's always been taken by a lot of people as regressive of me, that I want to go back to some tradition. And being able to frame it that way, that like, look, no, I'm not saying go back. It's just, yeah, we've grown on top of it, but that core is where all the nutrient comes from and all of that stuff. And man, like, yeah, that was a real nugget of wisdom. So thank you.
Well, the speaking of nutrients,
we're very apt for where we're at in the story.
We are, and unfortunately, I have to go, guys. But
Okay.
I am looking forward to watching
Sean,
the rest of the
I'm
video.
so sorry that we're losing you. This has been a really just as you're going. I mean, I think it's so nice that a story like this can lead to these kinds of conversations.
Right.
It sort of proves how these two things are not isolated from one another, but directly associated.
Absolutely, and it wouldn't come if each of these things were spelled out, and if he had given us his intention throughout the entire thing.
Right, exactly.
And really, if that was the case, then why make the story? If you can explain it in a paragraph, why take months or years out of your life to draw it, right? Well, I look forward to hearing the rest of it, and I apologize, guys, that I have to run, but I'm gonna listen to the rest.
Great to see you again. We'll chat away for a little bit, and
let's do Nausicaa soon when you guys are done. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I got to read through it later, Sean.
Bye, Sean.
So also talking about roots and growing, and you, Alexis, since you're way more familiar, this has relationships to Princess Mononoke with like the spirit of the forest and stuff.
Yeah,
right?
very much so. Yeah, this is quite a different nuance in this story because of the way. I mean, I don't know if we should explain. I don't know if I even can explain, but essentially in this world, you have these green giants. He's come to this mystical place, but the world is like vibrantly alive, intensely alive. Where does this life energy come from? It comes from these green giants who are walking through the land and dying, and from their dead bodies, all of this life is rising up. And these green giants are emerging from this kind of living machine in the heart of this place. The ship that he saw flying across in the sky comes and visits the machine and deposits people inside, right?
Yeah, it's left a little unclear what happens to the people too. I don't know if I have that page, but yeah, he watches it's basically like a UFO that has gone and captured people from the part of the world he's from, is the sense I got. And then it comes and dumps the people into this big organic mechanism. Here's it dumping all the people. And then it says even here, I believe, like he can't tell whether the fluid that comes out is like the people compressed. Shuna couldn't tell whether the people after being swallowed were being reborn as the giants or whether they'd been turned into the water that irrigated the land. So like he's not even sure what happens. And I like that he leaves that little gap of interpretation. And I kind of wonder what's built into that. It's not clear to me immediately, but I think your assumption about which one of the two they turn into is probably kind of telling of something about yourself.
Yeah, it brings us back to this idea that when you're not prescribing content, you're then revealing yourself, the reader, because you have to insert your own understanding to make sense of it all. Because this didn't have to go through the filter of a whole animation team or the commitment of time that a whole comic would entail. It's much freer in its associations than a story than the kind of story we usually read would be. And this last section does feel very dreamlike, right down to its logic being not entirely coherent. But I like that a great deal. And I think, you know, it might not mean a specific thing, but it is nonetheless meaningful, or at least that's how I interpret it.
Yeah, and I would have to think about it more, because I do think there's built into that a choice for the reader, and whether that's intentional for him or, yeah, like a dreamlike kind of subconscious, because he seems so tapped into just a instinctual understanding. Do you actually, do you know how old he would have been in 83?
Well, how old is he now? He's in his 80s, isn't he? So if we wind back, he's in his 70s and the 10s and 60s, and so it'd be in his 40s, I guess, 30s, 40s.
Okay, so he's pretty like experienced at this point. I thought it was coming younger than that. But there seems to be such a instinctual understanding, and I don't know, I'd have to read more interviews or something to see how explicit it is, but there seems like a big truth baked into that, and like the duality is part of the truth, and I bet the assumption that people make, if you really spend a lot of time thinking about it, would belie something about the way they look at the world. But yeah, this is like feeding. So there's definitely this idea that like the slavery aspect of things is feeding the health of this other Eden world, and it's being condemned for that, right? Like Shuna comes in and is like, that's not appropriate, but he's going to go in and at least get his one little grain and get out.
Yeah, it's certainly a fearful energy. Like it's a big, complex, violent force.
Yeah, and I think there is something built into where like he doesn't take it upon himself to take down that whole system. Like as one person, he can't.
There's something very Promethean about it, isn't there? Sort of like it's like a theft from the gods.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, I can't beat the whole system, but I can steal the couple little healthy grains that I need, and I can bring it back to my little part of the world and make some positive impact there, and then grow out from that. And if that will ever have any impact on all of this awful stuff going on, you know, again, that's up to the reader. But I think it's, again, a healthy moral lesson about how to fight this kind of thing, is like get what you need from it to then make a positive impact where you're at.
But in another story, sort of that would be where the quest would end. One of the elements that I find the most interesting about this book is what happens after this point. And I suppose this is, you know, Sean was alluding to this earlier in relation to Ursula Le Guin. But in completing this act, in fulfilling his quest, as we shortly find out, he loses himself utterly.
Yeah.
And it's the two girls that he saved, Thea and her sister, I don't know whether she's ever named, who have to kind of bring him back to his humanity. I really, really like this. It's done at some length compared to the rest of the story. You know, usually with a quest story like this, once the quest is fulfilled, you tend to wrap up fairly quickly.
Yeah, but 4 pages.
Yeah, exactly. That's usually the way I would operate. But this is a hefty chunk, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a good, I don't know, 1/10 of the book at least.
It's one of the things that I was sorry that they didn't treat in the. I know they were running out of time with the Lord of the Rings cinema adaptations, but I always felt it was very important that the two elements, that one, the Shire was not, they couldn't return to the Shire. The Shire had been destroyed. And two, that Frodo couldn't, he had not, you know, there was no peace for him, no fulfillment for him. He had to go off and leave, that he couldn't be in the land anymore. Spent too long with the ring. There's something similar happening here, isn't there?
Yeah, and this is, I actually wrote the note, loss of identity, and that goes back to my kind of struggle. And we were even talking about this before we started recording, which seemed very apt, that we both felt like a lot of our lives have been allowed to be pretty selfish and childish in a sense. The life of an artist, is kind of, yeah, it's self-involved. You just had a kid. I've got like a career now for 2.5 years finally in my life. And I'm finding at least that as you actually become an adult, like I was complaining that, you know, I was allowed to remain a child or a teenager just by the circumstances of my life. And I've started to be unsatisfied with that. And I wanted obligations and responsibilities at a different level, because I felt like that's the only way for me to become someone I'm going to be happy with when I die. And but I've been struggling over the last 2 years because my identity up until then had been, you know, like I think that's what this break in the book that he puts in is so smart about, is there's a process after you've completed the quest. Like you've gone through, you've learned everything you need to learn, you've learned the lesson about coming back and taking care of yours and your own, but you're losing something in that. You're losing that, or you're evolving at least. And at first it feels like a loss of who I am. And I've been struggling with that a lot too. Like as I'm trying to become a better adult, I'm having to shed a lot of things or give up a lot of things that I really, really want, but there's just not time for them anymore. And I know that those are short-term selfish things. And so that's kind of what I saw this chunk of the book as.
Yeah,
And
completely. I mean, with a story like this, you're going to have to put a big slice of your own experience to make sense of it. But
yeah,
as we have somewhat similar life experience, that certainly resonates with me. There's this very difficult thing for the self to comprehend, is that, you know, when you've had a lot of autonomy for a long time, you have quite a conscious relationship with self. You know,
yeah,
you can think, oh, how am I doing today? What do I like? What do I want? How can my actions change this feeling of myself? But when you start to be when that's taken away from you by pressures and responsibilities and duties, you sort of feel like you've lost touch with selfhood. But of course, you didn't go anywhere. It's just no longer perceivable in the same way to your conscious and waking mind. But it is a very difficult thing to wrestle with. I also think it's like for a lot of people, you can fall into one of two traps. You can fall into the trap of thinking that your pain and your burden is uniquely horrible. And this
yeah,
happens to a lot of people because we all deal with stuff throughout our lives. Or you can fall into the other trap of thinking that because you have X, Y, or Z advantage that another person doesn't have, that your pain and your problems are meaningless or trivial. And I think both of those things are falsehoods, because, you know, we each experience only our one life. And traumas are traumas and challenges are challenges, you know, no matter who you are. It's very interesting watching a documentary on YouTube of Miyazaki as he tried to make this short film of Borrow the Caterpillar. There's a wonderful sort of hour-long film of him just going through that process. And, you know, we're talking about him here as the revered master, undisputed and revered master, because of what he's accomplished through his work.
yeah,
But as a man, he's tortured by a lot of very serious regrets and traumas related to work. The physical trauma of his body, having made all these thousands and thousands of drawings to the
yeah,
point where his shoulder is in constant pain. The emotional trauma of feeling like he used up the life energy of friends and colleagues in pursuit of his own personal objectives. And you know what, we
yeah.
talked about the relationship with his son and his family and the sacrifices they had to make. So I think, you know, and it's interesting that all those things are sort of touched on in his more youthful work. It's almost like he intuited, because he was such a good creator, because he was such an intuitive creator, he was able to tap into these truths without understanding, you know, how they might impact on his own life story later in life.
That's why I was asking how young he was at this point, because I was kind of trying to get a sense of like how early was he intuiting all of these things. Like I'm 41, so if he was like 40 when he wrote this, then it's like, okay, that's about like I think where someone who is gone through, had a career, had some of that stuff, had a life, they would maybe know it more explicitly. But yeah, I think there probably is a lot of intuition in it. I would add to that idea of like the two different ways of, I forgot exactly how you said it, but two different ways of dealing with those traumas. That second one you mentioned, I think there's another way that that can go afoul, is that if you are successful, uh, and you've gone through traumas to be successful, there's a danger too in like arrogance, like I know how to navigate this and turn it into gold. And the people around me who aren't doing that, it can be easy to, and I struggle with this sometimes, like, you know, because I deal with a lot of, I mean, I deal with hundreds of people that are 18, 19 years old, and they don't know how to navigate the things yet. And I constantly have to remind myself, like, to be gracious with them and not get irritated, because it's like, well, you're just not navigating things right, you know. And like, if you navigated them right, then you could be successful. And I can tell you, because like I've had X, Y, and Z amount of success. And so there's a danger the other way, if you're more egotistical in nature, you know, or narcissist in nature, that you can use that as other people around you are just being weak and incompetent and things like that.
I guess I didn't mention that because I probably fall into that trap sometimes. We don't like to articulate like actual truth.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
bit
well,
painful.
yeah, it's something that I, you know, I try and be as explicit with those things to myself as possible, but then that's also a trap, because you're like, well, I'm the person who can do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think a lot of that is built into this, whether intentional or not. And then what I really like, well, this also, because my partner has long COVID, this is speaking to me as well, because part of all of those struggles that I'm laying out right now are coming from the fact that she's got physical ailments that force her to be less competent than she is. She's an extremely bright and competent and hardworking person, and she can't be. And so I have to pick up even more of the load. And on my bad days, it's hard not to fall into what I just described. And they're showing like Thea. Meanwhile, Thea was working harder than ever. There was now also SHUNA'S food to think about. So he's become incompetent because of the hero's journey. And I think you're right. Normally, we don't talk about the mental consequences of the hero's journey, that could take you out for a while. And then even though you've done a great thing for society, you may now have expended too much of yourself and have become a burden on someone else. And then as you can't do some of your duties, not only are they having the duty of the caretaker, but now they're having to actual pick up the physical slack work. And then they also need the energy to come home and like take care of you, like, because he's comatose.
Yeah, he's a complete shell, a husk, if you will.
And so she has to become a hero in a much different way. And I think that's this last chunk of the book, is if you do that right, and if you align yourself with the right people who will go through that period of their own little hero's journey, it may be less bombastic, like that's your only hope for healing, is that family and community. And
well, I think it's them. They don't, I mean, he's so wrecked, he doesn't plant the seeds that he's brought back, does he? It's the girls who have to plant and tend for the seeds, as far as I remember.
Yeah, that's like right here, that's what she's doing, on top of having
to feed and look after him. And yeah, I think this is one of my favorite parts of the story, to be honest.
It's beautiful.
It's much more gentle also in, you know, we were talking a little bit about the visuals of the storytelling earlier, that grand kind of world building and myth making and all those wonderful compositions and action sequences and so on. And this is just more gentle in those ways as well. I find it very moving.
And like here, how you're talking, you're talking about the visuals of it. Yeah, there is some world building here, but there are a lot of no background shots, just the sky, just the field, reconnected with the earth and the community, and that whole big world doesn't matter anymore. It's shrunk back down to a tough but manageable level. You know, he's not fighting the big machine anymore, and he deserves his break. and then they just have like this local fight against the elements. And I mean, yeah, the artwork, I wouldn't have picked that out. You're much more in tune with those kind of shifts that he's doing. But now that you've said it, yeah, every page is way stripped down. It's amazing.
And here we have the echo of the opening image that we saw.
And the fruits of all of that, the revivified society that came out of the dead husk, found the live husk. Look at the colors on that one too. He's really,
yeah, I'm so happy that this was translated into English. He is one of those artists who's, kind of like a living treasure. He just has that ability to tap into these really fundamental, important energies, and do it in a way that feels inevitable and effortless. And it's just so rich in its communication. So to have this, and I really, really like this format as well. I'm quite inspired to give it a go. It doesn't feel as burdensome as a production of a comic or an animation, but yet the story that's told within, I feel like, is every bit as valid as those other works of his that I love so much.
It's almost more potent, and it's interesting because it is like, you do children's books, or you do illustrations for books as well, right?
Yeah,
like,
kids books for little kids.
yeah, so that this has that, it's like it's in between that and a comic, because you're never really getting dialogue balloons very often or stuff. It's always the picture and the words combined in the way that you would get more in a children's book. And it has that like distilled essence of the story that you would get in a children's book too. Like, it is a big epic, but it's like, let me just give you the most essential points out of the epic.
I love that. I've always aspired to empower the reader, have an active reader in anything that I make. I'm not always very good at it. I'm certainly not as good as Miyazaki, but it's something that I think is very, very important, that you kind of have to be an active reader to have the narrative function for you. And this is such a great example of that, where if you're willing to be engaged and put the work in to bring it to life, you don't have to put much work in, mind you, but if you need to be active and engaged in making this make sense, and it's very, very rewarding if you do.
Oh yeah, and also one of the things I love about doing these videos with people like you and Sean getting together and doing this is, I already had a pretty, I thought, rich interpretation of the book, and then you guys have, like, through conversation, just added so much more, and you start going, oh my God, yeah, like, how did he pack so much of that into this book? It's really astonishing. And then here at the end, I just wrote that in the end, it says, Shuna's journey is not yet over. The road to the valley is long and his troubles are far from finished, but that's a story for another time. So all of this stuff going on here, this wasn't even him going back to his family. This is in someone else's village that he's been beneficial to.
Broke another of those rules of storytelling. It didn't tie the didn't finish the circle. I suppose probably because, at that phase in his career, he thought maybe this was something that would become another series, or it might become a film, which would in turn become a series. But actually, there's something really nice about it not being a tied up ending. And I don't think it does need anything else adding to it.
No, and I think from that, like, more metaphorical standpoint, that is the right ending. Like, just because you don't complete the journey that you set out to accomplish doesn't mean you haven't made wild positive impact in the world, right? And then maybe you could still go back. It doesn't really matter. That's open. Maybe he goes on to impact 20 other villages, and that he never gets back, but someone else gets to, it leaves that open. And that also, just the openness of it left me think, like, Shuna's journey is not yet over, to me, was such a powerful statement, because then it's like, well, this whole thing is just a metaphor for the human journey. Like, we are Shuna's journey, and our journey's not over yet, and we're gonna have, and we don't know, we may never get back to the village, or maybe you never can return to your original village. Maybe it is, like you said, in the core of the tree, but you're gonna have to keep growing.
Yeah, there's only one way that movement is possible.
So yeah, this is an astonishing book to me, and I really thank you for like bringing up Miyazaki, and then the fact that you're willing to jump on, because we were talking about Nausicaa at first, but when I saw this came out, so let's do that new one. But I'm reading this because you wanted to talk about Miyazaki at some point, and I can't thank you enough, because obviously it was like one of those books that I needed that week that I read it.
Yeah, it's funny, these things sometimes just arrive at the time, the right time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, insofar as I had any responsibility for it, yeah, absolute pleasure. Miyazaki's an easy name to drop, but you know, I wish he would have made more comics and graphic works. I think he has a real facility for it, and it's wonderful to see his unfiltered voice like that. Of course, he's working with all these extremely talented collaborators on the films, but that's always going to be a different form of expression. So yeah, I mean, I hadn't read this before. I absolutely loved it. I'm quite inspired to try something similar. I would try not to be derivative in doing it, but
yeah, it's hard not to soak up too much influence. As someone who's a big fan of Miyazaki, like I don't have as much context like related to his other works. Like how do you value this one in terms of his other works? I'd be curious.
what, like in terms of like pantheon, where does it sit?
Yeah.
Well, it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. It's not completely fair. Also, a lot of the seeds, again, if you forgive the slightly ham-fisted pun, a lot of the seeds that are planted in this story they grow into other stories. So a lot of what's present in Shuna's journey becomes clearly elements of Nausicaa, particularly Princess Mononoke. There's a lot of content in here that is very much Princess Mononoke. I sort of feel like he was an artist who had there were impulses within him that he wanted to express, and they were just searching for their form. And if you watch all of his works back to back, or read all of his works back to back, you'll see the same motifs, emblems, and ideas recur consistently. So, I mean, in terms of where I rank it, I personally prefer this kind of his works of this kind. I'm not so much of a fan of the Kiki's Delivery Service, that sort of those sorts of films where it's just tonally a little bit different, world slightly different. You know me, I love the fantasy stuff. I love the dream stuff, and the things that are very pure personal expressions. I feel like this is kind of this is very him. So I think it goes in a group with those other stories that I love so much, with Princess Mononoke and Nausicaa. This together.
I guess maybe the real question was, like, having read this now, does that help? Because you see the seeds, like, does that enrich, like, those other ones get even richer for being able to track that? Because I think you're right, like a really good artist kind of has a core question that they're always going back with, and a book like this could show like the early struggle. And I'm gonna have to
it definitely doesn't take away from them. I think it is a little bit when you repeatedly try and express the same essence, and you're always going to be hitting a little bit wide of the mark each time, but if you repeatedly try and do it, the picture, the thing that you're aiming at starts to emerge, because your various iterations maybe touch on parts of that core. So in that sense, yes, it definitely does enrich his other works. I'm very interested to see this last film that he's working on now, because I think that's going to bring another voice in. You know, from what I understand, it's a much younger and more primal thing that he's doing, but we'll see. Yes, I would definitely recommend anybody to read this who is a fan of his films, because it will enrich your understanding of the things that motivate him, and, you know, his world's a very vivid one, so it's well worth spending as much time in there as possible.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I try and tell my students that all the time, that what you're really, if you want to have a long career in the arts, what you should look for, I call it the center of gravity, or like there's the core, and then you're gonna orbit the core. Like you're never gonna make a project just about that, but everything you do can be that, and it does give you the ability. Like one of my favorite images I've ever seen is, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like it's kind of a orthographic projection of a room, and there's a cylinder hanging, and there's a light from one side, and so if you push the light right, it's projecting a rectangle on the wall, and then you put a light from the other side, and it's a circle on the wall, and it says, "This is reality. This is reality," and you get that argument between the two perspectives, and then the point is like, no, reality is when you combine the multiple perspectives, right? And like all these political debates and something, it's like, no, there's some core truth in all of that. And I feel like an artist like Miyazaki, they're going to never solidify the stance. They're just going to keep looking at it from as many angles as possible, and there's a greater truth that builds out of that. So now you've got me really excited to go. We gotta go. That'll be good for Tori too, because she's been talking about watching some Miyazaki stuff. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to go do that and report back to you about.
Yeah, let me know how that experience goes.
We'll do.
I'm sure you'll love them. There's nothing else like them.
Well, thank you so much, Alexis. I really appreciate you checking back in with us. We've been wanting to check back in with all of our friends, and
yeah, it's a great idea. I mean, I absolutely love coming back to talk. So yeah, if later on next year, a couple of years, we think of something else that might be relevant for me to pop back in and have a chat, I would absolutely love that.
Oh yeah, we would love it too. Is there anything, I know we're like Curse of the Chosen is out. People definitely go get that. I'll put a link to the interview we did with Alexis about Curse of the Chosen, because it has this same type of just really archetypal, amazing fantasy stories that feels like something I haven't seen in the last 20-30 years, where we got back to core storytelling. So please go support that. But is there anything else you're working on that you want to give a quick promo for?
Well, I'm working on a new picture book for younger children called King School. It'll be out, I think, this year or next year. So if you have any small children, you can look out for that. But no, and then I'm going to try and, it's a new comics project, so we'll see. That's going to take a while.
Well, that'll be one of those things that you'll check back in for. We'll definitely.
It will be nice to see how it's unfolding. You know, it usually takes a few years to get these things done. So.
Well, awesome. I really look forward to seeing all that stuff, and really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Great to see you.
Have a good one, everybody.
Well. Have a wonderful day.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.